Well, good evening, one and all, and here we are again for our final installment in our fall series on Catholic thought, citizenship, and the common good. Our event tonight is called Election Roundup: Results, Reflection, Renewal, and I am truly looking forward to this conversation. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola, and I'm coming to you live from one of our many Loyola outposts through the wonders of digital technology. On behalf of our university leadership, and on behalf of Commonweal Magazine, who are co-sponsoring this event, and on behalf of the Hank family, who underwrites with their generous endowment our many endeavors, I extend a hearty greeting. A kind welcome also from our dedicated center staff, Center Manager Megan Toomey, Graduate Student Assistant Kathleen McNutt, and our undergraduate assistants, Catherine and Francis. They are most instrumental, all of them, in getting our events from farm to table, and I remain very grateful for their superb work across the board. So thanks team. As mentioned, this event is the final in a trio of fall events that considers the Catholic vote, broadly speaking. At roughly 23% of the population, Catholics are the second largest religious voting bloc in the US. But as we have seen in the past, and are seeing quite clearly this year yet again, Catholics are too large to consider as a monolithic group. They are not only split on the candidates and on the issues, but they're also split about what might even constitute a Catholic vote or voter at all. Given these two realities, the questions really do open up. To the larger arena, what I keep saying are everyone's two favorite topics: religion and politics. Regardless of how people square their approach to religion and politics, we do know how important Catholic thought is to citizenship and the common good, especially during times of intense disagreement and polarization. With its robust social teaching tradition, its robust Catholic social teaching tradition and thought, to be clear, focused as it is on a preferential option for the poor, taking care of the powerless and the marginalized, and watching with vigor for people who are disenfranchised and voiceless. We really do think that the CST is Catholicism's hidden jewel, even if it hides too often in plain sight. Our excellent interdisciplinary panel will have a word to say or two about these things as we assess together our current political context, reflect on its moral dynamics in leadership and in citizenship, and explore the possibilities for renewal and community in the wake of, quote, the most important election of our lifetimes. I just note here that most of us are probably have one eye here and another on our media and TV, and we will break in. We'll break in from New York, and we will as the news breaks. So know that, and we have a great group who can help us navigate whatever news we receive. So one more note here on format before I introduce our esteemed speakers. This evening's Zoomcast is classified as a webinar. This means that while the chat is disabled, you can ask questions and of course offer comments as well that we'll respond to. So use our Q&A feature, that tab there, to write your question or your comment. And I encourage you to do it actively and on the move as you hear something that piques your interest. So just write it in, type it in, and we will take it from there. So with that, let's welcome our speakers. And I want to thank them all each for saying yes to our invitation. These are the briefer biographies. You can check our webpage for the fuller account as you like. First, I'm so glad that Molly Andolina is with us. Molly is an associate professor of political science at DePaul. Her field of expertise includes public opinion and youth political engagement. She has published work on a host of topics, including the political activism of millennials, the relationship between faith and civic engagement among college students, and how issues impact college student activism. Most recently, her research has focused on the democratic skills engendered by a high school action civics program. So that gets into Gen Z, right? The iGen, which is great. While a research director at the Pew Research Center, Molly received training in quantitative and qualitative public opinion research, including surveys elite interviewing and focus groups, and the like. As an expert in the field, she has worked with the National Academy of Sciences, Committee on National Statistics, and NBC News. Welcome, Molly. Amanda Bryan, our colleague here at Loyola, is Associate Professor of Political Science, where she teaches constitutional law and judicial politics. Amanda's research focuses on the US Supreme Court, public opinion, and the separation of powers. Amanda received her PhD from the University of Minnesota in 2014. Welcome, my friend Amanda, good to see you again. Our colleague as well at Loyola is Professor Miguel Diaz, who is the John Courtney Murray University Chair in Public Service and was selected by President Barack Obama as the 9th US Ambassador to the Holy See. Diaz obtained his doctorate in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. He is a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America and a member and former president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, ACTUS. His forthcoming book, The Word Made Culture, includes a foreword by Cardinal Ravasi, who was the president of the Pontifical Council for Culture and Miguel's good friend. This book is the first in a new Orbis series called Disruptive Cartographies, Doing Theology Latinamente. It's edited by Miguel, Carmen Nanco Fernandez, and Gary Riebi Estrella. Welcome, Miguel. Stephen P. Millies is an associate professor and public associate professor, of public theology at Catholic Theological Union and director of the Bernardine Center there. Millies studied political theory at the Catholic University of America, completing his degree with a study of religion in British statesman Edmund Burke's Political Ideas. Before coming to CTU, Steve was associate professor of political science at the University of South Carolina, Aiken, where he held the Strom Thurmond Endowed Chair in Political Science. Steve is the Pierre Teilhard de Chardin S.J. Visiting Fellow in Catholic Studies right here at Loyola and in the Hank Center this semester, and it's been a true delight to have Steve with us and welcome my friend back to our Zoom stage. Finally, Dr. Bernard Prusak is professor of philosophy and director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Bernard was educated at Williams College, Exeter College, Oxford University, and Boston University, where he took his PhD in philosophy. Dr. Prusak's scholarship focuses on moral and social philosophy, and he has published widely in scholarly journals. He also writes for our co-sponsor, Commonweal magazine, where he worked as an editorial assistant before graduate school. Together with Dr. Jennifer Reed-Booley, his current project is an edited volume provisionally entitled Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought, Critical Constructive Essays, and is under contract with Paulus Press and set for a 2021 release. Congrats on that, Bernard, and welcome to our midst. So as our Teilhard scholar, Steve Millies drew the short straw, and he'll go first. We will follow with Molly, then Miguel, then Amanda, and then finish with Bernard. Each will speak for 5 to 6 minutes, and then we will open it up to vibrant conversation where we will integrate as many as your voices as possible. So without further ado, Steve, please, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much. And I want to begin with a note of thanks. It's been one thing Mike didn't mention in my introduction is I'm a Loyola alumnus. And so it's been wonderful to be back with the Hank Center with Loyola as a visiting scholar, even if it's been a strange semester when I haven't visited at all. But I'll be sure to see you all on campus whenever the world returns to normal. And for now, I'll just express my inexpressible gratitude to Mike, to Megan, to Kathleen, and to everybody there at the Hank Center. And with that, I want to begin, because it's 2020, I want to begin with a tweet. There's no better place to begin. There's no more articulate place in our public forum. And this tweet was sent out at 8:17 on the morning of Tuesday, November 3rd, Election Day, by Bishop Eduardo Nevares, Auxiliary Bishop of Phoenix. And it says, "Hello, friends. Today is the day to vote. Do not look at personalities. Look at each party's platform." And I want to begin with that because it strikes me as a sort of a characteristic example of the kind of political engagement that we've had from our church leaders over the last 5 decades, ever since the abortion issue began to dominate that engagement. What this tweet is suggesting to us, I think, is a view of political life that I want to characterize as peculiar. From the perspective of a Roman Catholic worldview. And the reason it's peculiar is because it's ignoring the virtues of the people running for office entirely. It's focused on an outcome. Look at a platform, look at what they will do, and of course, look particularly at that one preeminent issue that has been emphasized over these many decades. That's one set of reasons why I focus on this tweet. The other is because of this statement you may remember that was issued by the Republican National Committee Platform Committee during the convention this past summer. This very short resolution was released in substitution for a platform. The Republican Party did not prepare a platform in 2020. It says in part, the Republican Party has and will continue to support enthusiastically the president's America First agenda. And that's it. There's no new 2020 party platform. At best, the 2016 party platform applies here, which means a few things. One, we've been referred by the bishop to party platforms when one party hasn't presented us with one. And of course, the other main thing that it means is it's a rather strange directive that we should look to the platform of a party that has not enacted its last platform, or it might have adopted a new one. So I also want to illustrate, just with that small example, the quality of political advice that we're getting from church leaders, which I want to characterize as generously as I can, as sort of naive about how politics works, what the political process entails, and what we as Catholic believing citizens ought to be looking for in politics. But all of this is really just sort of the end point, I want to suggest, of a 50-year-long, almost 50-year-long Faustian bargain that has focused on that one issue, that's focused on getting the judges, that's focused on delivering the Catholic vote to get an outcome. That's the way we've approached this in these last several decades. And I want to suggest that Donald Trump and his perhaps rapidly ending presidency, I just wanted to be live and up to date on that as I glance over at the screen. Donald Trump's presidency has been the logical endpoint of this process. Because in exchange for getting the judges and delivering the Catholic vote and getting that outcome, what have we gotten? We've gotten the president who's publicly been exposed as paying off a porn star for silencing her about an affair. We've gotten Charlottesville. We've gotten the rise of ethno-nationalism. And now we've gotten a bungled pandemic response that has cost as many lives as 100 September 11th attacks. What we've also gotten in this looking glass situation we're in, with the fourth Catholic nominated by a major party for president of the United States in Joe Biden, we've gotten in 2020 a kind of a peculiar picture of Joe Biden as the non-Catholic candidate for office. Despite the rosary in his pocket, despite the mass he attends on Sunday mornings, and despite what seems to me, in my own opinion at least, to be the overall decency of the man, somebody that I'm rather happy to call a fellow Catholic, whether he's running for office or not, from what I know about his life. Yet, according to Lou Holtz, a surrogate for the president's campaign, Biden's a Catholic in name only. When Robert McElroy, the Bishop of San Diego, spoke out to say that one might, in fact, vote for whoever seems to be the best candidate, Biden or Trump, Bishop McElroy was attacked publicly by the Bishop of Spokane, by the retired Archbishop of Philadelphia. And the last thing I sort of want to point to is that all of this directs our attention, or should direct our attention, back to an observation that was made in 1976 by Father Brian Hare, now at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, who was at that time on the staff of the Bishops' Conference. He wrote a memorandum during the 1976 presidential campaign to the then president of the Bishops' Conference, Archbishop Joseph Bernardin, after the bishops had been through sort of the first attempt to try to influence the outcome of the election and influence the future of the abortion issue. Father Hare wrote a memorandum to to Archbishop Bernardine, in which he warned that all of this partisan activity or appearance of partisan activity eventually was going to feed back into the church, that there was a great risk in appearing to be for one candidate and against one candidate. There was a great risk in appearing to be a single issue church. And where are we now in 2020? The US bishops, I think because of divisions among themselves about this issue and other things, have been unable to give us a new faithful citizenship document in substance since 2007. There's been no statement from the bishops this week, as far as I can tell, urging that every vote be counted in the United States of America. And I looked at the bishop's website before I came on here today. I don't even really find a reference to the marvelous new encyclical from Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti. I find where you can buy it from the bishops' conference, but I don't really find anything about this document that's filled with so many wonderful reflections that we might think about as we think about our behavior as citizens. But the good news in all of this is I think that this election we're experiencing right now augurs a new moment. It's been 5 decades now, and I think there are a lot of reasons for Catholics on all sides of the issues to believe that what we've been doing no longer is working. No matter what the outcome of this presidential election that may well end tonight, we'll enter, I think, a new era when our approach to this has to change. Not only because it hasn't worked, because we've had 11 presidential elections that haven't stopped one abortion, and a 12th probably won't either, but also finally because I think there's a real danger that lies ahead. If President Trump loses his reelection campaign, I think there's a real danger that the Republican Party could go down a rabbit hole of becoming the party of white ethno-nationalism, the party that's trying to hold on to the past against the changes in the present and the future. And for as long as the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, institutionally at least, is identified with the party that promises change on the abortion issue, there's a danger that our relevance will be sunk into the same rabbit hole with that party. I think it's really important to start thinking about stepping back into a more nonpartisan space and taking a view of a broader range of issues, that range of issues addressed by Catholic social teaching that Mike mentioned a while ago, and to seize this opportunity that we might have with the second Catholic elected to the White House, perhaps as early as tonight. I think it's critically important for Roman Catholics in the United States to recognize this changed moment, how the last 5 decades have not delivered the results that we wanted, and how important it is that we recognize a changed America, a changed church, and the change that we might make possible if we rethink our political engagement.
Thank you, Steve, very much for those insights. I'm not going to cut in again until afterwards, but I want to let people know the Q&A tab is not showing up where it should be. So if you want to comment or question as we go, just message me, Michael Murphy, privately in the chat, and I'll collate those questions. Thanks very much. Please, Professor Andolina.
Hi, it's so great to be here. I want to thank Mike. I want to thank the Hank Center, and I'm really looking forward to being a part of this panel and listening to my co-panelists and learning tonight. Steve gave me a great setup because at the end he says we're talking about a new movement, a new time to pivot and look ahead. And of course, what I study are young people. And so if you want to know the future, you should look at who our youngest citizens are, our youngest voters. And that's what I'm here tonight to share a little bit with you. Just to give you just a short framing, one of the first things I look at when I'm looking at elections in young people is how many of them actually turned out to vote. And there's often a lot of criticism of the youngest generation that they don't vote at rates of older generations. And it's true that young people don't vote as much as older people do, but young people have always not voted as much as older people do. And in fact, this youngest generation is closing the gap between older voters and younger voters in terms of their turnout. So they're actually doing quite well in terms of turnout. They came out in droves in 2018. And I think we're on the road perhaps to break all records this time. Of course, we don't know how many people turned out until we're finished counting the ballots, and we're not finished counting the ballots yet. But particularly in battleground states, the youth turnout is high. The turnout is going to be high everywhere. So that gap may continue, but young people have stepped up during this election. So the first thing, of course, is, are they voting? And then the second thing is, well, for whom do they cast their votes? And there's a misperception that young people always vote for the Democratic candidate, and older people, they get more conservative as they age. And that also is a misconception. It's not true. It started perhaps in 1972 when young people first got the right to vote with the 26th Amendment. And they did vote disproportionately for McGovern in that campaign. But the rest of the time, young people pretty much reflected whatever the national vote was, until about 2004, when they started to pull away and vote more Democratic in the presidential election. And this was repeated in 2008. It was repeated in 12, 16. In the 2018 midterm elections, young people who voted cast 2/3 of their ballots for House Democratic candidates. In other words, 67% of young people voted for Democratic candidates for the House. So now we do have what looks like a bias, a leaning, a preference among this generation, both Generation Z and the millennials, for Democratic candidates. And I am going to show you a quick screen because it was repeated this last election, that I guess we're still in this election, of what the map would look like if only young people voted. And I hope you can see that. So here we have a blue United States. The couple of those that are gray, we don't have data for, but you can see that there is disproportionate support for young people, for Democratic candidates, and for in this particular election for Biden. And even in states that Trump carried, Florida, Texas, you see large numbers of young people voting for Biden at the top of the ticket. So there really is a preference among this generation for Democratic candidates, and they make a difference. So for example, 61% of 18 through 29-year-olds voted for Biden, 54% of 30 to 44-year-olds, so still a majority, but not as much. And then when we look at the next two age groups, they cast their ballots for Trump over Biden, 51-48. So there really are some generational differences. And as we go along, we can maybe get into some of the reasons why there are those generational differences, what issues are appealing to these young people, maybe some of the differences among them. They're not a monolith, but they are a distinct generation. They are engaged. They do see politics as relevant, and they're making a difference. I think if Biden carries Arizona and Pennsylvania, we may say if young people, if they were not the factor, were at least instrumental in those two victories. And so I'll pass the torch.
Thank you very much, Molly. Appreciate the insights. I love the, well, yeah, I have a graph to share too, but I'm gonna wait till we all speak. It's so tempting to do so now, but please, we'd like to hear from our colleague, the great Miguel Diaz. So Miguel, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks everyone for being here this evening on a very important evening for our nation. I wanted to take us back, and perhaps by taking us back, we can look forward to the future. And briefly, beginning with by revisiting Pope Francis's speech to Congress when he came to our land. And I continue to look back at the speech, and many times when I've shared it with students who have really never even seen it, I'm left, I'm left. There's a rewarding dimension of doing that and engaging them in terms of the different issues that the Pope addresses. And one of the central issues, if you recall from the speech, is this image that the Pope uses of dreaming and dreamers, which I see as both an epistemology. It's and by that I mean, the Pope sees dreaming as both a spiritual exercise and a way of seeing the world. And he selects four of our dreamers to engage the Congress and to engage our political leaders in this exercise of dreaming. He highlights Abraham Lincoln. He highlights Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton, which is interesting because we have a healthy mix there of both, explicitly religious leaders, as well as leaders that we may not necessarily place within that realm of the religious. As a good Ranierian, I think they're all religious, whether implicitly or explicitly, for those that are familiar with Karl Rahner's thought. But the Pope goes on to state in that speech, and I'm going to quote him here, that these men and women offer us a way of seeing and interpreting, right, reality. In honoring their memory, he argues, we are inspired even amidst conflicts. We are inspired even amidst conflicts, and in the here and now of each day to draw upon our deepest cultural reserves. I think this is a moment in the United States that we must draw upon our deepest cultural reserves. We are in desperate need to do that, especially as we have just witnessed a little bit over an hour ago. The president of the United States basically undermined democracy in the highest office of the land by promoting falsehoods with respect to democracy, with respect to our election, and with respect to voting that is being counted as we speak. I don't want to take too much of our time, but I do want to offer three distinct quotes from that speech about the nature of political leaders, about politics, and about political society. I think these are very, very, very relevant statements that the Pope makes in that speech that are and relevant to our times, to this evening, and to what is happening in our country. The first one that I want to share is the following quote. He says, quote, "A political society endures when it seeks as a vocation to satisfy common needs by stimulating the growth of all of its members, especially those in situations of greater vulnerability or risk." There goes the option for the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed. Legislative activity is always based on care for the people. To this, he tells the congressmen and women and the leaders of our country, you have been invited, called, and convened by those who elected you, end of quote. The second quote, all political activity must serve and promote the good of the human person and be based on respect for his or her dignity. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If politics must truly be the act of service of the human person, it follows, the Pope goes on to say, that it cannot be a slave to the economy and finance. Politics is instead an expression of our compelling need to live as one, in order to build as one of the greatest things, the common good. That of a community which sacrifices, key word here because of so much this centeredness and narcissism that we've seen in our country, that sacrifice particular interests in order to share in justice and peace its goods and interests. And the last quote, and then I'll surrender my time here. Quote, a good political leader is one who, with the interest of all in mind, seizes the moment in a spirit of openness and pragmatism. So a good political leader is one that seizes the moment in a spirit of openness and pragmatism. A good political leader always opts to initiate processes rather than possessing spaces. I invite us all to think about those quotes in light of what's happening in our country and those leaders that today at the highest level of the land are trying to possess spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diaz. Much appreciated. Welcome to our Zoom stage, Dr. Bryan.
Hi, and I am likewise really excited to be here tonight, and really excited to be back with the Hank Center. Um, Mike may remember that the last time I spoke at it was actually a pre-election Hank Center event in 2016. I was speaking to the Hank Center students about the Catholic youth vote, and this was about a week before the election in 2016. And I remember distinctly saying the quote, "Well, Hillary Clinton winning is a given. So now we just have to think about what that means in terms of the Catholic youth vote." And
I remember that so well, Amanda. I remember that so well. I'm telling you. So I know you have things to say about that. I'm so glad you brought that up.
yeah, well, I was thinking about that a lot after I got your email about this event because I frankly thought I'd never be invited back. Um, I have been, I'm sure, like the rest of the country, staring at the same electoral map for about, I don't know, 2 days, feels like 2 years, looking at Nevada and Arizona and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and trying to think critically about what is the soul of these places and what does a candidate, Republican or Democrat, need to do to appeal to Nevada and how different Nevada is to Wisconsin, is to Michigan, is to Pennsylvania. I've been staring at this map so long that my husband actually emailed me a map this morning of state by state where it's legal to own a kangaroo, just so I would look at a different color coded map. And in light of this event, something occurred to me that I think probably should be obvious to the people in this virtual room, but wasn't obvious to me until this morning, that the demographics that we've been talking about in this entire election, white, college educated suburban women, Miami Dade Cubans, Central American, Mexican, recent immigrants in Arizona and Nevada, the changing demographics of Atlanta, the unifying feature of these like very different types of groups tends to be their overwhelming Catholicism. And if we can point to a thing that unifies the voters that have been pivotal in this election alone, it's their Catholicism. And as Mike really pointed out very appropriately at the beginning of this, the Catholic vote either doesn't exist or certainly isn't a unified vote. But I guess the question that I wanted to kind of start our conversation with tonight, and the question that I've been wrestling with a lot, is maybe it should. If American Catholics have not only 25% of the population of this country, but also uniquely inhabit the kind of pivotal the pivotal electorate that both sides seem to be fighting over, is there a space for church leadership to be kind of directing that vote, and kind of activating the Catholic social teachings that kind of underpin our faith? And so, if there's a way to use Catholic social teaching as a form of, if not political power, then certainly political direction, then I wonder if the church is underutilizing its own political power. And one of the things that is both most notable in this election is kind of what has happened to the Catholic vote over the last 20 years. Um, and not only the things that mattered in the election, but the things that didn't. For instance, the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, who is not only a practicing Catholic to the Supreme Court, but also probably one of the most vocal advocates against abortion that the court has ever seen, at least explicitly, mattered not at all to voters of either side. It might have energized Democrats. It didn't particularly energize Republicans. And the other thing that didn't seem to matter is that the notion of a single issue voter on abortion kind of doesn't exist anymore. And if it does exist, it no longer exists with Catholic voters. Rather, it tends to exist with evangelical voters or born again Christian voters, self identified born again Christians. And I think that what this really indicates to me is that if the church is going to move into kind of more of a direction to appeal to its voters, focusing on abortion as that issue isn't appealing to the Catholics that are voting in this country anymore, but rather the kind of direction that Catholic social teaching and the focus that Catholic social teaching has taken under the leadership of Pope Francis to the preferential option for the poor and healthcare and climate change are really avenues where American Catholics have an opportunity to be lobbied by their representatives and represented by those representatives in, I think, really interesting and new directions. So with that, I think I'll leave it there. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Bryan, very much. So glad to have you back and appreciate it. Bernard, the baton is now passed to you, my friend.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mike, for inviting me to join the discussion this evening, and thanks everybody for being with us. So here's my angle. It's a little different. I'm speaking from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, in the northeast corner of the state. And as you know, the state remarkably has the eyes of the world upon it at the moment. It's a great feeling. So Wilkes-Barre is less than 20 miles from Scranton, the very much celebrated birthplace of Joe Biden. And the two cities share an airport where Donald Trump held a rally on Monday. I'm a native Philadelphian myself, and as a Philadelphian before moving here, I had thought of Wilkes-Barre and Scranton as much the same place. As it happens, they're quite similar in terms of demographics and culture. They're largely white, Catholic, post-industrial cities, populated in part by the descendants of coal miners. One difference, though, between the county in which Wilkes-Barre is located, Luzerne County, and the county in which Scranton is located, Lackawanna County, is that Luzerne County is a so-called pivot county that voted Obama in 2008 and 2012, but then Trump dramatically in 2016. To give you just some numbers, whereas Barack Obama won Luzerne County by more than 8% in 2008 and nearly 5% in 2012, Donald Trump won it by more than 19% in 2016. Today, as we speak, Trump is winning Luzerne County by 14%. There are, as you can imagine, all sorts of possible explanations for why Luzerne County has pivoted to Trump. For example, in the New York Times yesterday, the columnist Charles Blow commented that it is unsettling to consider that many of our fellow countrymen and women are either racists, or accommodate racists, or acquiesce to racists. He also went on to observe that Trump's brash, privileged chest thumping and alpha male dismissiveness and in-your-face rudeness are evidently aspirational to some Black and brown men and appealing to some women. Now, I don't doubt that racism, machismo, and patriarchy might explain some of President Trump's support. That said, I've had a lot to do with Trumpists over the last 4+ years. Trumpists have towed my car, fixed my heater, repaired my house, given me medical care, and worshiped with my family at church. What I have to report is that they're not all, or even half, racist, sexist, homophobic, and xenophobic, living in a Fox News dystopia. What's more, that sort of condescending explanation is neither charitable nor penetrating. We need to do better, in my opinion, if we're to overcome and not exacerbate the divisions that will persist beyond this election. So what's a better explanation? I think it should begin with the acknowledgement that, as some political scientists have argued, social identities shape voting behavior more than policy preferences do. A lot of people, and I dare say most, don't have clear policy preferences, for example, with respect to immigration or trade. But they do belong to a culture, and they respond to politicians whom they understand and who seem to understand them. The historian Stephanie Moravchik and the political scientist John Shields argue in their book, Trump's Democrats, that in many Obama-Trump pivot counties, the political culture has long been Trumpian. Sure enough, Trump cuts a familiar figure here in Luzerne County. He's the old-style Democratic boss who is crass, thin-skinned, and nepotistic, and promises to take care of his people by cutting both deals and corners if need be. In these places, Moravchik and Shields document, an honor culture persists, according to which you must never ignore a slight. You must defend your reputation or honor by always responding to insults. When others go low, in other words, you go lower, all of which I'm sure rings a few bells. So against that background, the otherwise ridiculous image of Donald J. Trump as the bodyguard of Western civilization, as he was presented at the Republican convention in August, begins to come into focus, I think. He's the bodyguard of people who feel slighted by the diploma divide, and for whom, accordingly, his niece's allegation that he cheated his way into college and thereby played the gatekeepers of high culture was only another feather in his cap. He's the protector of people who feel threatened and demeaned by what Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, calls the overwhelming woke cultural tide that has brought a sea change to the media, academia, corporate America, Hollywood, and lately professional sports. Lowry goes on to liken Trump crudely to the only middle finger available to his supporters to brandish against the people who've assumed they have the whip hand in American culture. I'm afraid that sounds about right. Trumpism is a class-based cultural identity politics. The proverbial million-dollar question for whoever aspires to lead us beyond Trumpism, whether that be Joe Biden next year or Kamala Harris or Marco Rubio in another 4 years, is whether a politics of the common good has any constituency. Currently, and it seems increasingly, politics is where we meet as a nation only to be driven further apart. So those are my happy words to share with you this evening.
And I'm glad you shared them, Bernard, quite a lot. I'm going to stay with you on that because you raised the issue. It's the toxic rot of polarization to separate so vastly that we lose seeing the humanity of people with whom we disagree. And you cite that with the so-called Trumpists who take care of your health care and your car and give you a high five at church, well, from a social distance anyway. Our families, we're all mixed up in this, and we know that to be true. And somehow the pollution, though, gets encouraged by, it seems, one party more than another, or one person, which we cannot say that. Still, it really is important because you tell the story of America in many ways. And there's something I'm looking at with some of the things that Amanda was mentioning, and I think everybody was mentioning in one way or the other, which is trying to explain how President Trump gained more votes in certain demographic sectors, certainly up in every category in recent polls, but down in one that you would least expect, down in white men and up everywhere else last time I checked. And so I wonder, like, if the panel can, maybe Bernard, you start, but the panel can talk about those dynamics, because it seems like there's something about with the American dream there in some ways, where in my family, so many were Irish Catholic Democrats, and then maybe they shuttled away from that as they gained wealth. And maybe the Democratic Party shuttled away from them. But there is a tendency in this country that you start in position A, and then you shuttle up in position B, and then you believe that position A doesn't sorry, get that screen share out of here. This looks like a bomber coming in. Do you see that, people? Bernard.
I see it. I'm not sure the person's a bomber. I think.
Okay. I don't know how that. So thanks for seeing that. Anyway, just if you can comment on just being careful with polarization as we try to renew our lives together as Americans. Bernard.
Thanks, Mike.
Anytime.
I'm not sure entirely where to go with that. Let me comment on the last point, being careful about polarization. That's so difficult to do. So I was at a soccer game. One of my kids was playing a few days ago, Tuesday, in fact. We were in Western Wayne County, which felt like Western Maine. It was like, an hour plus from wherever we are, and just deep in the woods. And I felt like I was in a alien cultural terrain, really. Now there are plenty of Trump signs around here, and plenty of back the blue signs, and so on and so forth. lots of Biden signs and, signs saying, dump the turd on November 3rd or so on and so forth. But in Western Wayne County, where we were, there's a deep Trumpist vibe, the pickup trucks and the paraphernalia and so on and so forth. And again, I felt alienated, and I think I felt somewhat elitist, and was certainly tempted to a condescension as well. All of which really need to be resisted. No doubt, again, some of Trump's support can be explained by racism and misogyny and patriarchy and machismo and so on and so forth. It's really risky to go down that path when we assess our fellow citizens and see first and foremost that aspect of our citizens when we think about support for Trump. I highly recommend that book by John Shields and Stephanie Moravchik. It's been helpful for me. Trump's Democrats, they spent a few months living in these pivot counties to try to understand the political culture in those places, and they got a quite different point of view from one that you derive, let's say if you're reading principally the New York Times. And I read the New York Times, but if that's your only point of view on this divide, I'm not sure it's always a very helpful or humanizing one.
Thank you. Any of our other panelists want to comment on this broad dynamic of polarization? I see your hand, Steve. Go ahead, please, Steve.
Just a couple of quick thoughts. First, I'd be careful about assuming we know the demographics of this election just yet. This data is very raw and the samples aren't very big. It's going to be a few months before we really know. And so I'd sound that note of caution. But I want to pick up on what Bernard said a moment ago too. It's the hard struggle of the time that we are in. And I say this as the director of the Bernardin Center. And my brief includes building common ground and reconciliation and peacemaking and trying to knit the church and American society back together as well as I can contribute to that. And yet I think we have to observe that it isn't just as simple as patriarchy and racism and all the other things that travel with it. It's actually become even simpler than that. Because what this has led to is the politicization of public health. And it's led people to make decisions that have inflicted disease and death on other people in a way that's unlike, practically any other nation in the world. We've got this terrible problem where we're infected with polarization more than we're infected with the virus. And it's really had this cost. I want to say really quickly too, last, I take the point that the single issue doesn't drive the voting behavior. I agree very much that social identities drive the voting behavior, that this approach has evolved into a kind of a cultural metonym, right? That we've taken on these identities and we've chosen our sides. The toxic idea here, though, I think that we don't talk enough about is the one that Francis talks about a little in Fratelli Tutti, the question of what makes us a people. That's the deep question here. And it's got the axis of time, the fourth dimension, I think is very important here. Are we looking backwards to identify who we are primarily, or are we looking to where we are now and looking forwards to identify? Because those racial assumptions and those gender roles and even the assumptions about American power and American freedom are all rooted in the American past. And the desire to hold on to that as hard as we possibly can is, I think, finally the social identity that divides us most and is, in fact, literally the most dangerous.
Molly, Dr. Annalena, then Dr. Diaz. Thank you.
I just want to join in. I'm really enjoying listening to everybody and learning and hearing your different perspectives. And just to throw in a very political science perspective, and we talk about partisanship or whether or not you're a Democrat or a Republican for there's different elements of partisanship, and there is a partisanship that's cognitive, that it's based on the issues. So you sort of figure out where your issues are, and then you develop your identity as a Republican or a Democrat around that. But more and more, we're seeing that the partisanship that Americans hold is an affective partisanship. And so it becomes a partisanship that is like what Steve has talked about, what Bernard has talked about. It's cultural, and it, instead of being informed by issues, it informs where you stand. And that's why we're having a global pandemic viewed through the eyes of partisanship instead of having it viewed through the eyes of science. It becomes the way in which we view the world. And it's a really dangerous way because, of course, in this heightened atmosphere, it also becomes dehumanizing of the other. It makes an attempt to discredit, delegitimize, and not recognize the inherent dignity of each person with whom we interact. And so that shift is a dangerous one. But I would like to build off of what Steve was saying. I would like to say that I really think if we think moving forward, where do we want the conversation to go? We have to rethink what our social contract is, right? What do we owe each other as parts of this collective? Who are we when we come together, and where do we want to go? What do we want to make of this world? And I think if we could frame it away from the sort of the politics and the policy, and to think more about what it means to come into a society together and make choices about how we live. And if we could frame it that way to govern it. And I think, frankly, a lot of that means teaching our students very early on to think about government and politics from this perspective, and not to think about even how a bill becomes a law, for them to really drill down and to think about, this is what it means to be part of a society. This is why we create governments. This is what it means to come together and decide how we want to live.
Thank you. Dr. Diaz.
Yeah, so I struggle with, in full disclosure here, I just got off the phone with my mother, whose birthday is today, from Miami. I grew up in Miami. I'm a Cuban American. So these issues are not abstract to me. The issues of family fights, in the sense of political differences, with someone who was the first to be educated in his family. So this kind of divide between the educated and the rest of the family who didn't have that kind of opportunities, because my parents took me out of Cuba when I was a child. And as an adult, and the very reasons that they took me out of Cuba are the very reasons, paradoxically, that I'm so opposed to the Trump administration, because I sit there and literally struggle with my parents and say, how could you buy this stuff about Biden being a socialist? I mean, Biden has done Trump has done everything that you took me out of Cuba to literally prevent me from experiencing, the violations of fundamental human freedoms, the freedom of the press, the freedom of religious expressions, and I can go on and on and on. And yet I see, I'm the first one to have seen the witness, and I was part of Biden's group, Cubanos for con Biden, but we just saw what happened in Miami, right? And now it's sort of like, now we've become the stereotype of the nation. The Cubans in Miami are responsible for Florida not going to Biden. So I want to just state that in terms of the complexity, of course, of the issues that we're dealing when it comes to social identities and social and the social formation, and even the familial and the Catholic dimension in all of that. The second thing is that I'm not quite ready to abandon yet the need for the church for all of us. And I say that as a Cuban American, because I have challenged my parents and I've challenged other Cuban Americans to say, there is solid racism. And I was raised thinking that, we have café con leche, but it's better to be more on the side of milk, leche, than it is to be on the side of café, right? So there are all of these implicit things that we are not even aware of, that are racialized structures all around us that inform us. When the president spoke an hour ago, I was almost in tears because the first reactions out of African Americans, what was it? How dare him say this? He wants to stop the counting. And where is that counting? Primarily in a lot of these places that are African American. So not only does he want to disengage a community that now he sees is not voting overwhelmingly for him, so he has to question, well, how come all this vote is going for Biden and not for me? But he has to then act as another silencing its power, right? From the highest office of the land to silence a majority of people that clearly, because outside of Miami, 70% of Latinos and African Americans are voting overwhelmingly in support of Biden. You know, we have to, as Catholics, deal with that. And we can't just say all these people are, not pro-life or they're pro whatever it is that you want to say. And so that's the other side of this, is the pain of years and years of xenophobia, racism that comes both in words and deeds. And you don't erase this with, by just simply another president. I mean, this is healing that we need to do, and it's going to take a while. But I just don't want to all too quickly go from the Good Friday to the Easter Sunday, as we Latinx people like to say. In the United States, we love Easter, but what does Easter cost us? We lose the ability to be compassionate and to enter into the pain of another human being. And I think that's a huge mistake that the church makes, is that we want to bypass Good Friday, put on our nice clothes, and get to Easter Sunday without really engaging one another. So.
Okay, Miguel, thank you very much. You really have distilled, I think, a lot of what we're saying here in this group. And, if you think how soon we forget some of the earliest gospel messages from Jesus in his indictment of tribalism. So I've said this before. It is one of the major things that he, in his public ministry, it's over and over again, the indictment of tribalism. Yet, in our Catholicism in the U.S., as disparate groups as disparate as, the Napa Institute or those who might support the Kino Border Initiative are both Catholic, and they think that they're in their own way of being, that they're supporting the common good. So, and we all know every Catholic you meet will give an epithet before they say they're Catholic, right? They'll say that they're a blue Catholic or a liberal Catholic or a JP2 Catholic. So it's so baked in on that, but you really name it again so very, very well, my friend. I wanted to return to our political scientist with a pointed question from a student. This is Emma Mitchell, and she has questions for Dr. Andalina, Dr. Bryan. She asks, will the next generation of young Catholics bring in a new wave of nonpartisanship in the church, if that's what is called for? Or will the increased political activism of the next generation lead to increased polarization and maybe a re-identification of the church with the Democratic Party or maybe the Republican Party, who knows? And then there's an allied question from Judith Carpenter, who asks, to what extent are young Catholics voting Democratic? So I don't know, Amanda, maybe you want to take that on, maybe the voting patterns, or Dr. Andalina, Molly, as you'd like.
Molly, why don't you start with the youth voting patterns? Because I don't think there's a better expert to answer that than you.
Well, I don't know if we can break it down as for young Catholic. Unfortunately, we need larger sample sizes than anything I've seen so far. I will tell you that the Catholic youth vote is a lot smaller than the Catholic vote, because if you look at young people, for example, if you look at millennials, 16% of millennials are Catholic. 30% are unaffiliated entirely, what the Pew Research Center calls nuns. So this is an increasingly secular generation who rejects a lot of institutions, and the Catholic Church being one of them. The most religious millennials are evangelicals. They're not Catholics. So I think there's even a smaller block to have a vote. Now, when it comes to some of the issues that align with Catholic social teaching, I think there's an alignment with millennials, Gen Z, and a lot of those values. The values of taking care of the environment, the values of the preferential option for the poor. There are a lot seeing healthcare as a right. seen immigration as a positive thing for our nation. These are all widely held by the youngest generation. So from that perspective, but a youth Catholic vote, I think Amanda can speak more directly to the faith and the expression of faith than I.
I think that again, this is the political scientist in me. That the Catholic Church, if anything, has a messaging problem with millennials. That while Catholic social teaching is very definitely in line with millennial values, and you read the encyclicals, especially coming out of Pope Francis, and you listen to millennial politics, and you think these things are in line. As Molly points out, millennial Catholics and Gen Z Catholics are falling away from the church at rapid numbers. And part of what not only dilutes the church's membership, but I also think dilutes the church's political power, if we're thinking about those millennial Catholics 20 or 30 years from now, is that the church hasn't been very good at getting out the message to these millennials that they share their values, when in fact they really do. And so if we expect millennials or the generation below them to come back to the church, both as an act of faith and as an act of political organization, the church needs to do a better job communicating to millennials and communicating to Gen Zers that the church is not their parents' church or their grandparents' church, and that especially the political dynamics of the church match their values much more than I think millennials think that they do. Not that the church needs to change, because the church is in line with their values, just that the church needs to change its focus or change its messaging.
May I push back a bit there, for purposes of discussion? I'm not sure I recognize the church you're talking about, Amanda. Sorry to have to say that. I mean, you and what we mean by church here too, but there could be our church as we understand it through some of Francis's teachings. But let's think about the church as it is with the bishops we have in the United States. Bishop McElroy is an exception here. His movements to rewrite faithful citizenship got rejected. He's been critical of calling abortion the preeminent priority, but nonetheless, that's what it got called by the bishops. So I'm not so sure that the church, as it's embodied, at least by our bishops in the United States, really does align with what you termed millennial values. And I don't know that it's just a messaging problem then too. I mean, instead, it's a question of who has power within the church. Francis has been changing the bishops to some extent, but very slowly. I mean, the American bishops have really been a source of resistance to the change that Francis has been calling for. So anyway, there's my pushback.
Go ahead, Steve.
Do you mind if I jump in on that? And by the way, there are so many threads here I want to pick up. I think we ought to agree to just go another 2 hours. There's a lot here in this conversation, but I want to say, Brenda, there's something else we haven't named here tonight, which is that all the events that we've talked about have taken place inside the reception of the Second Vatican Council, which is one of the drivers of the division in the church that's part of the division outside the church that we express in social and political life. And the question you're raising is an ecclesiological question. In one sense, the church is its leadership. It is the Pope and the encyclicals and the bishops. In another sense, the church is hundreds of thousands of young people who may not even be Catholic, protesting in the streets of the United States during this past summer for what Catholic social teaching says. How we conceive of church is very much one of the questions that we're divided about. But I like very much, just personally, because I think we have these resources that can help us overcome some of the division by taking that more expansive and that more inclusive view. And I wish the bishops and the institutional church would catch up. I'd love for them to. But I think the church is where the people are.
Yeah, thanks. Amanda, did you want to respond to me since I responded to you?
Yeah, Bernard, I don't think that we disagree so much as I might not have been as precise as I should have been in my language. By messaging problem, I mean personnel problem. I mean how it presents itself. I don't think that the institutional church is as aligned as the theological values are, specifically in Catholic social teaching, as millennials would like it to be. And so if the church is going to change its messaging, it needs to change its personnel, it needs to change its structure. And so in that sense, yes, the church needs to change to appeal to millennials, but I don't think that the church needs to change in terms of doctrine or tradition or teaching. It needs to change in terms of emphasis.
That's interesting. Let me just stick with that for a minute here. This was a question for you, Steve. It's my question, but as you were speaking, I wrote this down because you brought up ecclesiology and you mentioned people like the kind of Ronarian anonymous Christian, which can be a problematic but also beautiful concept. But being a Catholic in name only, that's dangerous. Because people really are more Catholic than the Pope these days, which seems impossible, but it's true. And when we've arrived here, as we have, we know we've become the Pharisees that Jesus indicted in his social ministry, and in his brief sojourn here. There's an anti-Francis feeling by not a few people. And it really does affect a kind of ecclesiology that we're just living through. We're in this crucible of trying to see where we're going to go. So I think, Amanda, you're speaking about that. Bernard, you clearly are. Molly, you clearly are as well. But Steve, I know you've addressed this explicitly. Anybody can respond, but Steve, how about you go first?
No, I think that's right. And I certainly did have Rana in the back of my mind. I'll thank Miguel for that when I said that. But I will add, it's the church is here to encounter and to accompany and to bring about metanoia, to bring about conversion, to bring people to where they are meant to be in the light of their progress towards salvation, in the light of the gospel. That's what the church is here for. And you mentioned the Catholic in name only stuff. Many others have said it, and I'll only say it briefly. It's notable that that's usually conditioned according to a social or a political question, not according to creed or dogma or the tenets of faith. We're all in different places, even those of us who are standing in the sanctuary on Sunday morning, and we're all works in progress. The challenge I think we have here today is to embrace that difficult challenge that the Second Vatican Council has set in front of us to live our faith differently in all the spheres of our lives. I don't think we've really matured fully into that. And I'll say last, I don't think it's unrelated to Bernard's earlier question about whether there is a constituency anywhere for a common good politics. I think the difficulty we have living our mission is not unrelated to the difficulty we have living our values as citizens in a republic.
Miguel, please.
No, I just wanted to return to something that Amanda, because Amanda did pose this question about the Catholic vote earlier, and I thought that it was at least deserves a little bit of a discussion, and I have myself pondered upon that question, but also from the perspective of in some ways that we mirror the polarization in society. We mirror that polarization in-house when it comes to our Catholic faith, right? And so how many times have we both experienced, Latinx Catholicism and then Anglo-Saxon Catholicism, or the Black Catholic experience, and the kinds of even discrimination that occurs within our churches with respect to these different expressions of Catholicism. Some of them that are more rooted in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Latin American and traditions, and some that are not. I just finished teaching today on James Cone in both the Protestant and the Black Catholic experience in the United States to my students. But it's one of those things that we also don't make those experiences, and this is where the issue of power comes in, right? We don't make those experiences as quote unquote normative or as central to our traditions. It's sort of like, okay, if we teach Latinx theologies for Latinx people, or maybe a couple of souls there that are interested in the topic come into the classroom, or the same thing can be said about the African American. And I think that the same is not the other way around, because the expectations are that the other version of Catholicism is the normative version of Catholicism. And so before we even start to to address the polarization that occurs and start pointing fingers outside of ourselves, we have to deal with some very difficult issues inside our house. And why it is that, X number of Catholics vote this way and X number of Catholics vote that way. Well, if we were to take polls and votes within our Catholic parishes, we would probably show that kind of polarization when it comes to even the diversity that exists in our own churches. And so I just want to, I don't have an answer to this, but I think that the polarization that is widespread, it's for me, it's very, 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 very worrisome. But it's something that is right in our families, as I stated before, with respect to my own Cuban American family, and it's also in our churches. And it's like, okay, but how do I deal with? I need to tell the facts. I need to tell this is racism because it's not right to do this to another human being. And how do I name it or compassionately get people to realize that, no, Trump just said some lies. We cannot live with those lies. This does not build us up. A society built on lies is not a good society. And so I get passionate about this because I am really concerned about the country and about what 4 years of tweeting lies have done to our culture. So.
Boy, maybe I could segue there. Again, we're all right in realizing we have so much. I have 75 questions from the audience.
Oh my gosh.
I've already put 2 in, but can we let's have a minute for social media? I have 2 words for you, maybe 1 word, Twitter, and then I'll say Catholic Twitter. What has that done to our the common good and our civic life discourse in this country? Just to do like a lightning round here. Molly Andolina, I'm going to start with you. What do you think social media has brought to polity and civic life?
Oh, it's very distressing, of course. The way in which we have siloed our media is awful, and especially to get to something Miguel was getting at, the ability to have misinformation travel around social media and get passed around social media is very, very dangerous. So it's easy to talk about all the difficult things. I will say, though, that social media, and for me, that my only social media is Twitter, can also open up places, right? You can hear voices that you did not hear before, and you can follow people on Twitter and on Catholic Twitter and realize that you do have commonalities, that you have some shared perspectives. And so I do think there's a place there where we can use it positively, but it means a willingness to be open, a willingness to look for stories and voices, and to be careful of misinformation and hyper exclusivity.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on this one?
I will.
Thanks, Amanda.
I think that what was a missed opportunity for social media is that social media is one of our few cultural platforms that does not have a partisan bent. There's not like liberals go to Twitter, but Republicans go to Facebook, but independents go to Instagram. That the prominence of social media across partisan groups really made it an opportunity for us to finally have a conversation where we talk to each other. But the structure of social media, and by that I mean the intentional creation of the product, where if you click like on something, you see more content like that, has created both an echo chamber and made our partisanship worse. And so there is an opportunity for social media to kind of be, if not rich discourse, there's no such thing as rich discourse in 160 characters, but at least opening discourse. But that would really require a drastic shift in how the companies that create social media construct it and what it's used for. And we don't control Facebook.
Thank you. I'm gonna bundle some questions here from our esteemed crowd, and I want to thank our audience for tuning in. So, panelists, if you could just write down anything you hear that you want to respond to, that piques your interest. I'm just going to read 4 questions. Here's from Holly Gensley. And she says, I appreciate and agree with Bernard's description of the Trumpists. What future are these folks envisioning? They seem very short-sighted and fail to recognize the changing demographics. I'm sure there's probably other things, but that's a question out there for your consideration. Here's the next one. I recognize this name, Dr. Naomi Fisher from Loyola, and she asks, is there a way forward for Catholics to be politically engaged without compromising either on the abortion issue or on important social policy issues, or is stepping back to a nonpartisan space going to be the future, to step back from nonpartisan engagement? Is that in our future? David Rothrock asks, do Catholics or voters in general understand what is even meant by the common good? And do we really understand what solidarity means? I think both terms are essential to Catholic thought, but do we really understand what they mean for our country when we speak them aloud and for our vote? And finally, one more from Joyce Bell. This is a little long, but I'm going to read it. A commentator said recently that Trump was able to tap into the middle-class truck drivers, construction workers, coal miners, and those whose lives are coming apart. Trump promised to save them. Only the ways in which he chooses to save them runs contrary again to Catholic social teaching. Let's see here. This is from my sister, Suzanne from California. So I have to give her a shout out. She says, how this goes on in broad daylight, Trump has blatantly taken advantage of people. That's what Susie asked as well. So anybody want to grab any of those thoughts? Bernard, I see you. Why don't you begin?
I think I was able to note down 2 of those thoughts, so I'll go at 2 of the 4. As first, let me speak to Holly's question. So you asked what future are Trumpists envisioning in light of changing demographics? I suppose I should note first Steve's caution earlier that we don't know yet, just how different demographics went in this last election. We have some preliminary numbers, and those were the numbers that agitated Charles Blow in his column yesterday. I will note that, at least according to what we know presently, about 25% of Hispanics voted for Trump. So I hosted an event earlier today, and one of the participants was Milton Javier Bravo, who works for Commonweal, our co-sponsor. And Milton made the point again and again: there's no such animal as the Latino vote. It's quite variable. But even with growing numbers of Hispanics, does that mean we're not going to have as many people who would support a Trumpist-like political movement? That doesn't seem to me to be a given. Also, Trump attracted a surprising number of Black male votes, at least from what we know so far. That might seem shocking to people, and again, really got Charles Blow quite upset. So that's just the beginning of an answer to your question, which is a good one. Let me just speak a little bit to the common good, and then I'll stop. So I think that the only way to come at the concept of the common good, is what I do with my students, is to ask people to think of goods that you can only enjoy in common, so-called irreducibly social goods. And you begin with conversations. How about family? How about marriage? A party by yourself is a really lame party. You can go down the line. So again, friendship. We don't really appreciate how important these goods that we can only have in common with others are to fulfilling human lives. We just don't tend to think that way, at least in our culture. Political society is another common good. You can't have a political society all by yourself. That's not much of a political society. So when we talk about the common good, I think we're talking about what measures we can take in order to ensure that this good that happens to be common can thrive. And a funny thing about common goods, take friendship or marriage, if you're in it only for yourself, that's a really sure way to destroy it. So, a politics of the common good would begin by recognizing that a political society is a common good, and that if we're in it only for ourselves, we're likely to destroy it.
Thank you, Miguel, please. And then anybody else who wants to help. This is probably going to be our last. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in here. I wonder also if we have to examine our anthropological presuppositions in terms of what I think, the phenomenon of Trump has made the kind of rugged individualism, narcissism, me, myself, and I, it's on steroids, right? And I love the Spanish word for we, for which we don't have a translation in English, because in Spanish we say nosotros, right? Nos otros, literally meaning a community of we requires the inclusion of others, right? The inclusion of difference, right? Nos otros. So every time we say in Spanish nosotros, we are reminded that the we includes the other, literally distinct others, right? When the highest officer in our land is constantly pointing to himself, myself, and me, and put America first, and everything is, it's directional this way, built upon on cultures that, this is not the Catholic culture, but the Catholic culture has bought into this kind of individualism. I wonder how this also presents an inability to empathize and to reach out of your comfort zone and to really listen to the story of another human being, and to embrace that story as part of your own human story. And I think we really ultimately have a crisis in the solidarity of the human with other human beings. And so we're incapable in some ways of, we've lacked the capacity to, maybe we have to train ourselves again. We have to do that training of empathy, right? Of reaching out and entering into profound solidarity. And again, that's a term that is thrown out there, but profound communion, profound relationship with others around us, beginning with those closest to us. And I said it's not easy. It wasn't easy today when I called my parents in Miami, and I know exactly what that boat was like, probably, in terms of the family and friends down there. So,
anything from it? Yeah, Molly, thanks.
I'd just like to say amen to that, because I do think the one thing that we can do is empathy, and to extend empathy, to ask questions, to listen to stories, and to attempt to understand. And it's only by connecting on this human level, really where Bernard kind of started us off in many ways, to see the people around us, to see them as our fellow travelers, and to extend empathy. My daughter's youth group at our parish says that they are radically inclusive. And I love that phrase. And I like to think that we could try to be that way with the people that we meet, that we encounter, that we want to be radically inclusive. And the way to do that is to extend empathy and to listen to their story.
Okay, yeah, Steve, please.
Unmuting myself. Let me follow that trajectory really and add, I agree with everything that's been said, and it's been wonderful. Let me add, I think we need to recover the courage to fail. We need to recover the humility that says we're not going to get it right. But that's why we have one another. I really would want to recommend to everybody those paragraphs, my copy of Fratelli.
Steve is freezing on my screen. So Steve,
I'm not going to go get it, so I can't tell you the paragraph numbers. But those.
Oh, I'm going to ask you to hold, Steve, and then I'm going to ask one more question. Then we're going to move to wrap. So we have another student insight here. This is from Francis Rafferty, our esteemed student worker in the center and a Catholic Studies minor as well, environmental studies major, I believe. And she asked this. Going off of the social media question, I disagree that there is a not partisan social media. If anything, like websites like 4chan have actually bred bigotry and fueled the conservative party. I think more than that, but we get the meaning on the internet. What do you think about this? Let me add too, there's a QAnon congressperson elected this, I think from Virginia. I hope I have that right. An openly QAnon person who is now in the bicameral Congress of the United States of America. So I think I'm going to leave that there as a text without comment, because we know that Pope Francis talks about this in Laudato Si, that the technocratic paradigm is not neutral. The content is also part of the message, and in digital life, we have to at least admit that to be possible and probable. Let me just ask our panel though, to close. And I didn't really ask this in our emails leading up, but I think you can handle it. So think back on just the last 4 years, or even the election season, and that's your background. But just tonight, name maybe a rose and or a thorn as you think about just your experiences as an American, as a Catholic, as a person, just tonight. So I'd like to ask you to go first there, Dr. Diaz.
The thorn would be the walls and all the talk of walling ourselves. That would be the thorn. I think we need to stop that. Whether the material image of a wall or the relational image of a wall, it's something that will never get us anywhere. It certainly will not get us to encounter one another. I think a rose is the amazing determination of our fellow citizens. And I'm going to go on the limb here and say, regardless of party affiliation, but in the midst of a pandemic, which is killing, as we've seen now, record numbers of our fellow Americans, documented and undocumented. Mostly, also we know that there's a racial and ethnic divide there too. The kind of hope that offers to all of us to fight for this democracy, to fight as faithful citizens for a better country, a better church, and a fostering of a humanizing of our relationship. I think that's what offers me that's the rose.
Thank you, my good friend. Dr. Prusak, have you any thoughts about roses and thorns?
I did at first, but then I had a brainstorm. I've got like 15 thorns for you. Maybe a rose or two. So how about, can I do two each? So for rose, I think I'm echoing here, Miguel. The huge turnout for the election really was remarkable. Lines, round corners. I waited an hour, not bad. And I went back later. I was just curious, and the line was just as long. That was really remarkable, especially in the midst of a pandemic. So that's a rose. Another rose, just that at least in some places, even places with substantial transmission of the virus, schools have been able to be open, which is, I think, so crucial. Thorns, and I'll be quick. We really didn't talk very much about the pandemic tonight, which is really interesting.
You have an article on this, Bernard. I mean, that was one of my questions I had, but please continue.
I wrote 2 articles about it, but we didn't talk much about it. And in my panel earlier today, people didn't talk much about it either. Either you could say the pandemic then was really not much of a factor, it really didn't decide people's votes, or you could say that but for the pandemic, Trump would have won in a walk. The only way that he can be booted is that we had a major pandemic and economic recession. But anyway, thorns, we had 108,000 new cases today. The pandemic's just burning. Other thorn, though, last one. We talked about this a little bit, though. My fellow panelists tended to be quite optimistic, I think. But I think there's a serious loss of faith in institutions in our country. And toward the top of the list is the Catholic Church. That's a thorn that will take a good long while to pluck, if I have to extend the metaphor.
inhabit the metaphor. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. Dr. Amanda Bryan.
I guess in the spirit of 2020 and there being more thorns than I think anybody ever could have expected, I'm not gonna list them. Maybe because there's so many, maybe because I don't want to focus there. But I guess my rose, and this is truly the joys of not only being a professor, but being a political science professor, are watching my students navigate elections and being not only first time voters, but having their own political awakening. And this year, more than any, when everything can seem so negative, and frankly, so many things are so negative, watching my students getting excited about the political process, getting excited about political discourse, and just wanting to show up and make the world a better place every election year, that's always my rose.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. Appreciate it. Dr. Millies.
Let me take up the theme of optimism and do it in a contrarian way. I'm very encouraged by the president's press conference and his lawsuits and the way that he's decided to handle this. Because along the lines of the voter turnout and the response of, and I've seen it in Loyola undergraduates this semester as I saw it in Carolina undergraduates for many years too, we've all become defenders. We've all become recruited to the cause. It's actually rather remarkable, the opposition that we have finally found to this undermining, the metal that we finally found in our backs. And I'd like to think that that's a place where we can begin. That's my hope as we sit here tonight. And so in a way, I hope he keeps doing it. I hope we finally really see it, and I hope we finally really rediscover what we're meant to be as a political community and as a church community. The thorn I'm going to name along the way as we do that is my own feeling of being right. Because that's the danger. That's the narcotic. That's the thing that destroys us. That's the thing that drives polarization. The more right I feel, the more happy I feel about an election outcome, the more sure I feel that the other guy's lost and that's good. That's the thing I need to guard against. That's the thorn I want to jam into my thumb and keep feeling the pain of it. Because we have to remember graciousness. We have to remember we're here for one another. I love that note of nosotros. We don't do it any other way than together. And that means I can't be right. Always, anyhow.
Many thanks, Steve, for those wonderful words. Finally, Dr. Andalina, please, roses and thorns from you.
Well, I could list a lot as well, and I am a glass half full person by nature. So I'm going to start with the thorn and be able to end on a positive note. And the thorn to me touches on the pandemic, which we haven't talked about, because I have witnessed among my students and I've witnessed among a lot of people, a lot of anguish about the loneliness and the loss. I have watched my students, I've watched my children, I've watched family members, and there's just so much loss, and the losses are small and daily, and the loneliness that people are having to live with, and they're large, they're losses of life. And so I think that we need to acknowledge those thorns because they're real, and they are going to leave marks when we pull them out. There will be a mark where they existed. And so that's my big thorn, or several thorns. And I guess to turn to a rose, I can think of lots of roses, but one rose I think about are all those amazing poll workers, right? And ballot counters, who are people who are either volunteers or they're civil servants, and they believe in this democratic process, and they believe in protecting it, and they are giving selflessly in order for the rest of us to be able to live here and to live under a democratic system. So I think that they're phenomenal. I think we all owe them a debt of gratitude. I saw on Twitter earlier today that somebody said they should be Time's Person of the Year. this year, because they have sacrificed so much for the rest of us. So I'll leave us on that positive note.
That's wonderful. I think we just show our appreciation. I mentioned last time, our last Zoom gathering, that as a kid growing up, every year after year, we had the elections in our garage, and I got to build voting booths, and my mother was the inspector. And I tell you, those people are serious. The ethics, the devotion to the ideas of this country live so beautifully in people who work the polls. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Molly. I really appreciate this panel. It was everything I hoped it would be. And please, let's just show a little Zoom round of applause for our guests. Thank you very much. So many things I'm reminded of doing. My dad always said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, right? So, you know, I do think it's best for us to listen more with humility and realize that we belong to each other, and nobody shows up alone. So I want to thank you, and I just would ask just a quick minute to maybe let's just pray in a quiet way for the health of all of God's creation, and to invoke President Lincoln, that we may listen to and accompany or be accompanied by the better angels of our nature. Amen. Thank you one and all, and take very good care. Good night.